Hello, and welcome to History Sleep Stories. Before we begin our journey into the past, let's set the scene for a story that is both dramatic and foundational. It's a story not of kings and castles, but of collapse and survival. We often think of history as a steady march forward, but sometimes it moves backward. This is the story of what happened in the land we now call Britain after the mighty Roman Empire packed up and left. It's a story of how a province filled with villas, towns, and taxes transformed into a land of warring kingdoms, forgotten skills, and a new cultural identity. So get comfortable, and let's turn out the lights. We're traveling back to the 5th and 6th centuries to witness Britain's struggle after Rome's fall. The end of Roman rule. Imagine Britain around the year 410 AD. For nearly 400 years, it had been a province of the Roman Empire. To the people living there, Rome wasn't just a city in Italy. It was a system. It was the government that collected taxes. It was the army that manned the Great Wall in the north, built by Emperor Hadrian. It was the engineers who built straight roads, sturdy stone bridges, and towns with public baths and running water. Life, for the wealthy and for those in the towns, was organized, secure, and connected to a vast Mediterranean world. But this system was breaking down. The Roman Empire itself was in deep trouble. Tribes from what is now Germany and other areas were pushing into the empire's heartlands. The empire was also suffering from civil wars, with different generals fighting to become emperor. All of this meant that the empire needed every soldier it could get. So, slowly, over several decades, the Roman legions stationed in Britain were withdrawn. They were sent to the continent to fight in these desperate battles to save the core of the empire. In 410 AD, the situation reached a crisis point. With the legions gone, the cities and towns of Britain were left undefended. Raiders from Ireland, Scotland, and from across the North Sea began to attack the coasts. The people of Britain, who were Roman citizens, sent a message to the Emperor Honorius in the city of Ravenna. They begged for help. His reported reply was a historical bombshell. He told them that they had to look to their own defense. The empire could not help them. This was the official end. The Roman government, in effect, resigned. Think of it like a national government, and all its services suddenly disappearing. The tax collectors stopped coming. The soldiers who kept order were gone. The officials who ran the towns packed up and left. The money that had paid for everything vanished. For the average person, this was both terrifying and confusing. The system that had structured their lives for generations was gone. What were they supposed to do now? Who was in charge? The first consequence was a collapse of the economy. The Roman economy in Britain was based on two things: the army and the government. The army was a huge consumer of goods. It needed food, leather, metal, and pottery. This demand had supported farms and workshops across the province. With the army gone, this market disappeared. At the same time, the government had paid for its officials and services with coins, which were minted with silver and gold. With no government to pay for things or collect taxes, the use of coins stopped almost completely. People stopped getting paid in money. They stopped using money to buy things. Britain rapidly reverted to a barter economy. If you were a potter, you couldn't sell your pots for coins anymore. You had to trade them directly to a farmer for some grain, or to a blacksmith for a new tool. This made trade over long distances very difficult. The complex network of trade that connected British workshops to the wider Roman world shriveled up. The age of imported olive oil and fine French pottery was over. This economic collapse had a direct impact on the towns. Towns were the heart of Roman civilization. They were administrative centers, but they were also consumers. They relied on the countryside for food and on trade for goods. With the economy in ruins, people could no longer afford to live in towns. There were no jobs, no salaries, and no safety. Slowly, people began to leave the urban centers and move back to the countryside, where they could at least grow their own food. The great Roman towns like Londinium, London, Ebracum, York, and Aquisales, Bath, began to empty out. The buildings, once symbols of Roman power and culture, began to fall into disrepair. The struggle to survive had begun. The first leaders and the Saxon adventus in the power vacuum left by Rome's departure, new leaders had to step up. We don't know all their names, and the history from this time is very patchy, but we know the type of people who would have taken charge. These were local nobles, wealthy landowners, and possibly former officials of the Roman administration. They were the ones who had the resources, the land, and the connections to organize people. In the late Roman period, many of these wealthy men lived not in the towns, but in large country estates called villas. A villa was a complex of stone buildings, including a luxurious main house for the owner, and workshops, barns, and huts for the workers. It was a self-sufficient community. The villa owner was like a local lord. When the central government collapsed, it was these villa owners who were in the best position to provide local security and leadership. They could use their own money and their own workers to raise a small fighting force to protect their area from raiders. But these local leaders had a big problem. The raids from the Picts from Scotland and the Scots from Ireland were getting worse. The old Roman military defense was gone, and these local militias were not enough to protect the long coastline. According to a later British writer named Gildas, and from the archaeological record, it seems that one of these post-Roman leaders came up with a fateful solution. His name, according to tradition, was Vortigern. The story goes that Vortigern and his council decided to hire mercenaries, professional fighters from outside, to help defend Britain. They looked across the North Sea to the areas we now know as Denmark and northern Germany. The people living there were the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. They were excellent sailors and fierce warriors. Vortigern's plan was to offer them land and payment in return for their military service. It was a short-term fix for a desperate situation. So, around the middle of the 5th century, the first Saxon mercenaries arrived. The traditional date given is 449 AD. They came in their long, wooden ships with their distinctive gear and weapons. At first, the plan seemed to work. They fought off the raiders and were rewarded with land, probably in the eastern part of Britain, in what is now Kent and East Anglia. But the plan went terribly wrong. More and more Saxons, Angles, and Jutes kept coming. They weren't just coming as hired soldiers anymore. They were coming as settlers, bringing their families and their belongings. They saw the fertile land of Britain and realized that the people living there were weak and disorganized. The mercenaries who were supposed to be protectors turned into conquerors. According to the legend, the Saxon mercenaries eventually turned on their British employers. They demanded more land and more supplies. When the British leaders refused, the Saxons revolted. They began a full-scale invasion. They used their bases in the east to launch attacks deeper into the country. They burned villages, killed the local people, and took the land for themselves. This event is known as the Adventus Saxonum, or the coming of the Saxons. It marks the beginning of a long and bloody period of conflict. For the native British population, it was a catastrophe. They had lost the protection of Rome, and now the solution they had devised to protect themselves had backfired in the worst way possible. They were now facing a powerful and aggressive enemy on their own soil. The struggle for survival had just become a fight for the future of the land itself. The Age of Arthur? Separating legend from history, when we think of post-Roman Britain, one name often comes to mind: King Arthur. The stories of Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table are some of the most famous legends in the world. But who was the real Arthur? The frustrating truth is that we don't know for sure if he existed at all. The historical records from 5th and 6th century Britain are extremely scarce. The Romans were great record keepers, but that habit died out after they left. The people who could read and write were few, and they were usually monks who were more concerned with religious matters than with writing down current events. The first major source we have is a British monk named Gildas, who wrote a book called On the Ruin of Britain around 540 AD. He does not mention Arthur at all. So, where did the legend come from? It seems to have grown from a few fragments of history and a lot of later storytelling. If there was a historical Arthur, he was not a king in a shining castle. He would not have had knights in full plate armor, as that technology was centuries away. He would have been a military leader, a battle chief, living in a time of chaos. The most likely candidate for a real Arthur was a Roman-style general, known in Latin as *dux bellorum*, which means leader of battles. He would have commanded a force of mobile cavalry, the last remnant of the Roman army in Britain, or a new force modeled on it. In a time when most fighting was done on foot, a leader who could move quickly with a band of horsemen would have been very powerful and effective. The later Welsh legends, written down centuries after the events, talk about a great leader who won 12 famous battles against the Saxon invaders. The last and most famous of these was the Battle of Badon Hill. This battle, which probably happened around 500 AD, was said to be a massive victory for the British. It halted the Saxon advance for a generation, maybe 50 years, giving the British kingdoms in the west a period of breathing space. If Arthur was the victor of Badon, he would have been a hero who gave his people a temporary victory and a sense of hope. But he was not the king of all Britain. The idea of a single ruler of the whole island was impossible in this fractured time. Power was local. Arthur would have been the leader of one of the many British kingdoms, perhaps based in the southwestern part of Britain or in Wales. After the period of victory, the British fortunes declined again. The Saxons recovered and resumed their expansion. The British kingdoms were slowly pushed back. The legend of Arthur probably grew as people looked back with nostalgia to the time when they had a hero who could beat the invaders. They turned a successful battle chief into a mythical once-and-future king who would one day return to save his people. So while we can't say for certain that King Arthur was a real person, the legend points to a real historical truth. The 5th and 6th centuries were a time of war, and the British people did fight back. They had their victories and their heroes. The story of Arthur embodies the struggle, the temporary success, and the ultimate tragedy of the native British in the face of the Anglo-Saxon conquest. The Great War. Britons versus Saxons. The period from the late 5th century through the 6th century was a long, slow war. It wasn't a single organized conflict with two clear armies. It was a messy process of invasion, settlement, and resistance that played out over more than 100 years. It was a war for land and for survival. The invaders, whom we now call the Anglo-Saxons, came from different tribes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, but they shared a similar culture and language. They were farmers and warriors. They did not want to live in the old Roman towns. They preferred to live in small villages, often near rivers, with their own farmlands around them. Their method of conquest was to take over a piece of land, drive away or kill the British people living there, and establish their own settlements. The Anglo-Saxons advanced from their beachheads in the southeast, pushing westward. The native British people, who we often call the Britons, were forced to either flee, be killed, or be enslaved. The word Welsh actually comes from the Old English word Wallace, which means foreigner or slave. This tells you what the Anglo-Saxons thought of the people they were conquering. The Britons did not give up without a fight. They fought a long and bitter rearguard action. As we learned, they may have had a major victory at the Battle of Badon Hill, which stopped the Saxon advance for a while. But the pressure was constant. The British kingdoms in the west in places like Dumnonia, modern Devon, and Cornwall, Powys in Wales, and Gadodin in southern Scotland, became the last strongholds of British culture and resistance. One of the most famous pieces of literature from this time is a Welsh poem called Why Gadaden. It tells the story of a band of British warriors from the kingdom of Gadaden who traveled south to fight the Angles at a place called Catreath, probably modern Catterick in Yorkshire. The poem is a tragedy. Almost all the British warriors were killed. The poem praises their bravery, but it laments their defeat. It gives us a glimpse of the grim reality of this war. Even heroic effort often ended in failure. Over time, the map of Britain was redrawn. The Anglo-Saxons established their own kingdoms in the east and the south. And main kingdoms became known as the Heptarchy, which means 7 kingdoms. These were Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. The British were confined to the rugged western parts of the island, modern Wales, Cornwall, and Cumbria. Some Britons also fled across the sea to the peninsula of Armorica in Gaul, which they renamed Brittany, or Little Britain. This war was not just a military conflict. It was a cultural takeover. The Anglo-Saxon language, which we call Old English, became the dominant language in the conquered areas. The British Celtic language was pushed to the western fringes. Place names tell this story. Most of the place names in England are of Anglo-Saxon origin. For example, Tun means farm or village, Ham means homestead, and Ing means people of. You find these everywhere in England. British names survive mainly in the west, in rivers, Avon, Thames, and in mountainous areas. The Great War between the Britons and the Saxons fundamentally changed the identity of the land. Roman Britain was gone. In its place was a divided island, Anglo-Saxon England in the east and south, and Celtic Britain in the west and north. The struggle after Rome's fall had resulted in a new, and for a long time, very unstable world. The death of the towns and the end of comfort, one of the most visible signs of the fallen collapse of Roman Britain, was the death of its towns. In the Roman era, towns were the centers of civilization. They had stone walls, forums, public squares, temples, and especially public baths. The baths were not just for washing. They were social centers, like a combination of a modern spa, a gym, and a community center. Aquae Sulis, modern bath, was famous for its complex built around natural hot springs. After the Romans left, this urban life collapsed with stunning speed. The reasons were all connected to the economic and political collapse. First, the economy that supported the towns vanished. The towns were not primarily industrial centers. They were places where government officials lived, where taxes were collected, and where wealthy landowners from the countryside came to spend their money. They were centers of consumption. With no government salaries and no tax money, the people whose jobs depended on that system had no income. The potters, weavers, and other craftspeople who made goods for the town dwellers lost their market. Second, trade collapsed. The towns were connected by Roman roads and by sea to a vast trading network. British goods were exported, and luxury items like wine, olive oil, and fine pottery were imported. With the empire in chaos, and with no one in Britain able to pay with coins, this long-distance trade ground to a halt. The people in the towns could no longer get imported goods. Third, and most importantly, life in the towns became unsafe and impractical. The stone walls of the Roman towns were still standing, but they were designed to keep out small bands of raiders, not a full-scale invasion. They were also a trap if you had no army to defend them. With no central authority to maintain public order, the towns became lawless. There was no one to repair the aqueducts that brought fresh water, or the sewers that took waste away. As a result, people simply left. They abandoned the stone buildings and moved out to the countryside. There, they could be closer to the source of food. They could live on a farm or in a small village where they could grow their own crops and keep their own animals. It was a return to a more basic, rural way of life. Archaeology shows this process clearly. In the layers of soil in places like London and York, you find rich Roman layers with coins, fine pottery, and building remains. Then there is a layer of dark earth. This is a thick, dark soil full of organic material and debris. It shows that the stone buildings were collapsing, and the areas were being used for gardens, or were just left empty and filled with rubbish. People were still living there, but not in the Roman way. They were squatters, living in wooden huts inside the ruins of great stone buildings. The great Roman public works fell into disrepair. The baths at Aquae Solis eventually flooded and silted up. The hypocaust systems, underfloor heating, in villas broke down and were never fixed. The skill to maintain them was lost. The comfort and luxury of Roman life, which had been available to the wealthy and the middle class, were gone. For the people living through this, it must have felt like the world was becoming poorer, darker, and more dangerous. The knowledge of how to live in towns, and the desire to do so, faded away for centuries. Life in a post-Roman village for the vast majority of people in post-Roman Britain, life was not about kings and great battles. It was about the daily struggle to feed your family and stay safe. After the collapse of the towns, the focus of life shifted completely to the countryside, to small villages and farmsteads. The typical home for a common person was a simple wooden building, very different from a Roman stone house. The most common type was the sunken featured building, or a grubenhaus. To build one, you would first dig a pit about 3 feet deep. Then, you would build a wooden A-frame roof over the pit. The floor was the earth at the bottom of the pit. These buildings were cheap and easy to build, but they were dark, damp, and smoky. They were probably used as workshops or for storage. For sleeping and living, people likely built larger, ground-level wooden halls with a central hearth for cooking and heat. The center of life was the hearth. There was no electricity, no gas. Fire was essential for cooking, for heat, and for light after sunset. The smoke from the fire would drift up and out through a hole in the roof. The inside of a house would have been very smoky, and everything would have been covered in a fine layer of soot. People's diets became much simpler. In Roman times, there was a variety of food available, including imports. Now, people ate what they could grow or raise themselves. The main crops were wheat and barley, which were ground into flour to make a coarse, dark bread or porridge. They grew vegetables like cabbages, peas, and beans. They kept animals for food, pigs, sheep, goats, and cattle. They also hunted wild animals and gathered nuts and berries from the woods. Meat was probably not eaten every day, but saved for special occasions. Work was hard and physical. Almost everyone was a farmer. The whole family would have worked from sunrise to sunset. Men did the heavy work of plowing the fields and tending to the large animals. Women were responsible for the home, for preparing food, for making clothing, and for looking after the children. Children would have helped with chores from a very young age, like fetching water, feeding the chickens, or weeding the garden. Clothing was made from practical materials. The Romans had imported cotton and silk for the rich, but now people used what was available locally. Wool from sheep was the most common material. Women would spin the wool into thread using a drop spindle, and then weave it into cloth on a large loom. The cloth was then dyed with colors from local plants, yellows from weld, blues from woad, and sewn into simple tunics, dresses, and cloaks. Leather from animals was used for belts and shoes. There was very little luxury in this life. There were no shops to buy things from. If you needed a pot, you had to make it yourself or trade with a local potter. If your plow broke, you had to fix it yourself or get the village blacksmith to help. Life was local, and it was focused on the basics: food, shelter, and safety. The grand ideas of Roman law, administration, engineering were distant memories. The struggle was to get through the winter and to hope that the next harvest would be good. The power of the church, a new kind of Roman, while the Roman government and its armies left Britain. One institution from the Roman period managed to survive and even grew in importance: the Christian Church. In the chaos, the Church became a lifeline not just spiritually, but also as a source of stability, learning, and leadership. Christianity had been introduced to Britain during the Roman period. By the time the legions left, there was an established network of bishops and churches, especially in the towns and in the more Romanized parts of the country. When the towns declined, the church had to adapt. Like everyone else, church leaders moved to the countryside and established monasteries. These monasteries became the new power centers of the post-Roman world. A monastery was a community of men, monks or women, nuns, who dedicated their lives to God. They lived by a strict set of rules, praying and working together. Monasteries were often built in remote, isolated places, which offered safety from the violence of the times. Places like Tintagel in Cornwall, or later, Lindisfarne off the northeast coast, became famous monastic centers. The church was important for several key reasons. First, it was the last preserve of literacy. In a world that was forgetting how to read and write, the monks and priests kept this skill alive. They needed to read the Bible and other religious texts. They also wrote letters and kept records. The most educated people in Britain were now the clergy. Second, the church provided a sense of continuity. It was a Roman institution that had outlasted the Roman Empire. Its organization, with bishops and dioceses, was based on the old Roman administrative system. For the native British, the church was a symbol of their Roman past and their civilized identity, which set them apart from the pagan Anglo-Saxon invaders. Third, church leaders often acted as political advisors and diplomats. A bishop could travel between warring kingdoms more safely than a soldier could. They could try to negotiate peace. They were often the only people who could communicate with different groups because of their education and their moral authority. The British Church developed its own unique traditions. It was cut off from the rest of the Christian world in Europe, so it developed different ways of calculating the date of Easter and had its own style of monastic life. The Celtic monks were known for their dedication and their missionary zeal. They produced beautiful art, like intricate metalwork and illuminated manuscripts. Most famously, the Book of Kells. Though this was made in Ireland and Scotland, it is part of the same Celtic Christian tradition. However, the church was also a point of conflict. The native British Christians saw the invading Anglo-Saxons as pagan enemies. There was little effort to convert them at first. The British Church was a church of resistance, a spiritual fortress for a people under siege. This would change at the end of the 6th century, when Pope Gregory the Great in Rome sent a mission to convert the Anglo-Saxons, led by a monk named Augustine. This created a new divide between the older Celtic British Church and the new Roman Catholic Church that was being introduced to the English. But in the difficult years after Rome's fall, the British Church was a beacon. It preserved knowledge, provided leadership, and offered hope and meaning in a world that seemed to be falling apart. It was a new kind of Roman power, the power of faith and ideas. The rise of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. While the British were struggling to hold on in the West, the Anglo-Saxon invaders were busy building their own new world in the East and South. They did not create a single, unified country. Instead, they formed a collection of small kingdoms, often at war with each other. This period is often called the Heptarchy, meaning the rule of 7 kingdoms, though the number and power of these kingdoms changed over time. The main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were Kent, in the far southeast. This was one of the first areas settled by the Jutes. It became a powerful kingdom early on, known for its trade with the continent. Sussex, Essex, and Wessex. These were the kingdoms of the South Saxons, East Saxons, and West Saxons. Wessex, in particular, would later become very important. East Anglia. As the name suggests, this was the kingdom of the East Angles. Mercia. This was a large kingdom in the Midlands. The name Mercia means border people, as it was on the frontier with the British kingdoms in Wales. It became a dominant power in the 7th and 8th centuries. Northumbria. In the north, this kingdom was formed from the union of two smaller kingdoms, Bernicia and Dara. It became a great center of learning and culture. These kingdoms were not like modern countries with fixed borders. They were more like areas controlled by a particular war leader or king. The power of a king depended on his personal ability to lead in battle and to reward his followers. This system is now called a heroic society. The center of an Anglo-Saxon kingdom was not a town, but the king's hall. This was a large wooden building where the king lived with his family, his bodyguards, and his closest followers. These followers were called thanes, pronounced thanes. A thane was a warrior who had sworn an oath of loyalty to the king. In return, the king gave him gifts, weapons, armor, gold rings, and most importantly, land. The relationship between a king and his thanes was the glue that held society together. A good king was a ring giver, a generous lord who shared the treasures won in battle with his men. A thane was expected to be brave and loyal, to fight for his lord until death. This created a powerful bond. The great epic poem Beowulf, which was written down later but set in this world, is all about this lord-retainer relationship and the duties of a hero. Life for the common people, or ceorls, pronounced churls, was similar to that of the British peasants. They were farmers, tied to the land. They had to give a portion of their crops to the local lord and to the king. They could also be called upon to fight in the local militia, the fyrd, when the kingdom was threatened. The Anglo-Saxons were pagans. They worshipped a pantheon of gods, similar to the Norse gods. Their chief god was Woden, like the Norse Odin, the god of wisdom and war. Thunder, like Thor, was the god of thunder. Tyr, like Tyr, was the god of law and justice. We still see their names in our days of the week: Wednesday, Woden's Day; Thursday, Thunder's Day; and Tuesday, Tuesday. Their religion was a warrior's religion, focused on fate, courage, and glory in battle. The rise of these kingdoms completely transformed the map of Britain. The East was now a patchwork of new, aggressive, pagan cultures, fundamentally different from the Christian, post-Roman British world in the West. The struggle was no longer just between Britons and Saxons. It was also between these new Saxon kingdoms themselves, as they fought for land and supremacy. The lost arts. What Britain forgot, the collapse of Roman rule, led to a catastrophic loss of knowledge and technology in Britain. The sophisticated system that supported certain skills and arts fell apart, and for centuries, the people of Britain lived without them. This loss is one of the clearest signs of how far society had fallen. The most obvious loss was in building with stone. The Romans were master builders. They constructed walls, forts, villas, and baths out of stone and brick, using mortar to hold it all together. After they left, the knowledge of how to make mortar and how to construct large stone buildings was lost. For the next 200 to 300 years, almost all buildings in Britain, from the king's hall to the peasant's hut, were made of wood. The great Roman ruins stood empty, and the people living near them did not have the skill to repair them or to build new ones in the same style. They saw them as the work of giants, a mysterious and vanished race. Another major loss was the art of making coins. The Roman economy was a money economy. The government minted coins of gold, silver, and bronze, and everyone used them. After 410, no new coins were brought into Britain, and the skill of minting them was forgotten. People stopped using coins for trade. They went back to bartering, trading goods for other goods. This made large-scale trade and a complex economy impossible. It was until the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms became more established in the late 6th and 7th centuries that they started minting their own coins again, and even then, it was on a much smaller scale. Pottery is another clear example from the archaeological record. The Romans had sophisticated pottery industries. They made fine, red-slipped tableware on a fast wheel and fired it in large, hot kilns. This produced strong, thin, and beautiful pots. After the collapse, this industry vanished. People went back to making pottery by hand, without a wheel. This grass-tempered pottery was coarse, thick, and fragile. It was functional, but it was a huge step down in quality and technology. It shows that the specialized skills and the organized workshops of the Roman period were gone. The art of writing also declined dramatically. The Romans used writing for everything: administration, law, business, and personal letters. After they left, there was no need for this kind of bureaucracy. The skill of reading and writing Latin became confined almost entirely to the church. The Anglo-Saxons used a runic alphabet for short inscriptions, but they did not use writing for history or literature at first. The great works, like Beowulf were passed down orally by poets called shops for centuries before they were finally written down. Even the concept of law and civil order changed. Roman law was a complex written system, administered by judges and officials. In the post-Roman and Anglo-Saxon world, law became local and oral. It was based on custom and tradition. Disputes were settled by local assemblies, and the guilt or innocence of a person was often determined by oath-swearing or by brutal tests called ordeals, like carrying a red-hot iron. The loss of these arts meant that daily life became poorer, less comfortable, and less secure. The comfort and order of the Roman world were replaced by a harder, simpler, and more local existence. It was a dark age, not because people were stupid, but because the complex system that supported high-level technology and culture had been shattered. It would take hundreds of years for a new society to develop the stability and wealth to rediscover these lost arts. The landscape of fear and the search for safety in a world without a central government or a standing army. Life was unpredictable and dangerous. The landscape of post-Roman Britain was a landscape of fear. People were afraid of invaders, of raiders, of their neighbors, and even of the supernatural. This constant state of insecurity shaped where people lived, and how they thought. The most immediate threat was violence. Raids from the Picts, the Scots, and the Anglo-Saxons were a constant danger, especially along the coasts and near the shifting borders. But there were also smaller-scale threats. Bandits and outlaws could prey on travelers and isolated farms. In a lawless time, a strong man with a few followers could take what he wanted from the weak. This fear led people to take drastic measures for safety. One of the most dramatic responses was the building of hill forts. This was not a new idea. People had built hill forts in the Iron Age, before the Romans came. But in the 5th and 6th centuries, many of these old Iron Age forts were reoccupied and refortified. People would choose a high hill with steep sides. They would build massive earthwork ramparts and ditches around the top. Inside, they would build their wooden huts. These hill forts were not towns where people lived all the time. They were refuge forts, In times of danger, the local population from the surrounding countryside would flee to the hill fort with their animals and their most valuable possessions. They would stay there until the threat passed. Places like South Cadbury in Somerset and Dinas Powys in Wales became important centers of British power and safety. For the Anglo-Saxons, safety was found in the Lord's Hall. The bond between a lord and his followers was not just about politics. It was about protection. A thane lived in his lord's hall, and the lord was responsible for his safety. In return, the thane was responsible for defending the hall with his life. The Great Hall was a symbol of safety and community in a dangerous world. People also looked to the supernatural for protection. Both the pagan Anglo-Saxons and the Christian Britons believed that the world was full of spirits and powers. The Anglo-Saxons wore amulets, charms made from animal teeth or carved from bone to ward off evil spirits. They buried their dead with grave goods, believing these items would be useful in the afterlife. The Britons, as Christians, prayed to God and the saints for protection. They wore crosses and believed in the power of holy men and women to perform miracles and keep evil at bay. This landscape of fear also affected travel and communication. The Roman roads were still there, but traveling on them was risky. Without the Roman army to patrol them, they became the hunting grounds of robbers. Long-distance travel became rare and dangerous. Most people never went more than a few miles from the place they were born. This isolation made local communities even more self-sufficient and inward-looking. The world had become smaller, darker, and more frightening. The Roman peace, the Pax Romana, was a distant memory. In its place was a world where you relied on your local strong men, your fortified hill, your God, and your own two hands to keep you and your family safe. The search for security was a driving force in everyone's life. A new language for a new land. One of the most lasting changes from this period was a linguistic one. The languages spoken in Britain were completely transformed. The fall of Roman power led to the death of one language and the birth of another. Before the Romans left, the main language of administration and the upper classes in the province of Britannia was Latin. If you were an official, a soldier, or a wealthy merchant, you spoke Latin. However, the common people in the countryside, especially in the less Romanized areas, continued to speak their native Celtic language, which we now call Brittonic or Common Brythonic. This was the ancestor of modern Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. When the Roman government collapsed, Latin quickly died out as a spoken language in Britain. With no schools, no administration, and no connection to Rome, there was no reason to speak it anymore. It became a dead language, known only to a few educated churchmen. The everyday language of the native British population remained their Celtic tongue. But then came the Anglo-Saxon invasion. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes spoke their own Germanic languages. These languages were completely unrelated to Celtic or Latin. As the Anglo-Saxons took over more and more land, they imposed their language on the areas they controlled. The British Celtic language was pushed back into the western fringes Wales, Cornwall, and Cumbria. In these areas, it evolved into the Welsh, Cornish, and Cumbric languages. In the east, the language of the invaders became dominant. Over time, the different dialects of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes mixed together and formed what we now call Old English. This is the direct ancestor of the English we speak today. If you were to hear Old English, it would sound like a foreign language, more like German than modern English. But many of our most common words come from it. House, man, woman, child, eat, drink, sleep. We can see the history of this conquest in place names. The map of England is covered in names of Anglo-Saxon origin. Common endings include ton, meaning farm or village, for example, Southampton. Ham, meaning homestead, for example, Birmingham. Ing, meaning people of, for example, Reading, people of Reda. Burg, borough, meaning fortified place, for example, Edinburgh. British Celtic names survived mainly for rivers and hills, features the Anglo-Saxons learned from the British. For example, the river Avon gets its name from the Celtic word for river, asterisk, aphone asterisk. So River Avon literally means river. The Thames, the Ouse, and the Wye are all Celtic river names. This linguistic shift was a slow process, but it was total. It shows that the Anglo-Saxon conquest was not just a change of rulers. It was a change of people and culture. The native British were displaced, and a new English identity with a new language was born. The struggle after Rome's fall resulted in the creation of England itself, and the language we are using right now is one of its most direct legacies. The last of the Britons, Wales and the West. As the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms expanded, the native British population was squeezed into the western parts of the island. The areas we now know as Wales and Cornwall became the final redoubts of the post-Roman British culture. Here, the Britons held on, and their kingdoms continued to exist for centuries. In Wales, the rugged, mountainous terrain helped to protect them. It was difficult for the Anglo-Saxon armies, who fought on foot to conquer this land. The British in Wales organized themselves into several kingdoms, such as Gwynedd in the north, Powys in the east, and Dyfed in the southwest. These kingdoms were often at war with each other, but they also shared a common language, the ancestor of Welsh, and a common enemy in the Anglo-Saxons. The kings of these Welsh kingdoms saw themselves as the true heirs of Roman Britain. They used Latin titles, and some even claimed descent from Roman officials. They continued the traditions of the British Church. The Welsh became famous for their poets and storytellers, who kept the memory of the heroes like Arthur alive. To defend themselves, the Welsh built upon the natural defenses of their land. They constructed stone forts and built earthwork dikes along their eastern border. The most famous of these is Offa's Dyke, but this was actually built later by the Anglo-Saxon king Offa of Mercia to keep the Welsh out. The Welsh had their own defensive earthworks, like Wat's Dyke, which show the long-standing border conflict. In the southwest, the Kingdom of Dumnonia covered modern Devon and Cornwall. Here, too, the British culture survived. They traded across the sea with Brittany, where other Britons had settled. Cornish, a language very similar to Welsh, was spoken here until modern times. Like in Wales, the landscape in this case, the moors and the long coastline, helped in their defense. However, life was not easy for these last of the Britons. They were under constant pressure. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, in particular, was aggressive in its westward expansion. Over the centuries, the borders of the British lands were pushed back, bit by bit. The Kingdom of Dumnonia eventually lost Devon to the West Saxons, and was reduced to just Cornwall. The British in these western areas developed a distinct identity. They were no longer Ramong. They were the Cymru, a Welsh word meaning fellow countrymen. Their world was a fusion of their ancient Celtic past and the Roman heritage they still cherished. They were a people defined by their long struggle and their determination to survive. Their story is a crucial part of Britain's struggle after Rome's fall. It shows that the Anglo-Saxon conquest was never complete. The British people were not wiped out. They were marginalized. The cultures of Wales and Cornwall are the living descendants of the post-Roman Britons, a direct link to the world that was lost when the legions departed. The mission of St. Augustine. A new Rome returns. For nearly 150 years after the Romans left, the Anglo-Saxon invaders had remained pagan. The native British Church, still surviving in the West, had made little effort to convert them, seeing them as the enemy. But at the end of the 6th century, a dramatic event changed the religious map of Britain forever. In Rome, Pope Gregory the Great was a man with a mission. He wanted to convert the pagan peoples of Europe to Christianity. The story goes that he saw some Angle slaves in a Roman market and remarked that they were not Angles, but angels. He decided to send a mission to bring Christianity to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In 597 AD, a group of about 40 monks, led by a man named Augustine, landed in the Kingdom of Kent. This is known as the Gregorian mission. They chose Kent because its king, Ethelbert, was the most powerful English king at the time. He was also married to a Christian Frankish princess named Bertha, who had brought a bishop with her. This gave Augustine a way in. Augustine and his monks approached King Ethelbert. The king, wisely, met them in the open air, fearing their magic if he met them inside a building. Augustine preached to the king in his court. He promised the king the support of the Christian God and a connection to the powerful civilization of Rome and the Franks. Ethelbert was persuaded. He allowed the missionaries to preach and gave them a base in his capital, Canterbury. He himself was baptized. Soon, many of his people followed. Augustine became the first Archbishop of Canterbury, a title that still exists today as the head of the Church of England. The mission was a success for several reasons. First, it came from the top down. The king converted, and his people followed. Second, the missionaries were tactful. They did not attack the pagan religion head-on. They allowed pagan temples to be converted into churches. They even incorporated some pagan festivals into the Christian calendar, turning them into saints' days. Third, they brought with them the prestige of Rome. For an Anglo-Saxon king, connecting to this ancient, powerful civilization was very attractive. However, this new Roman mission created a conflict with the old British Church. Augustine met with British bishops and demanded that they conform to Roman practices, especially the way they calculated the date of Easter. The British bishops refused. They saw the Roman mission as a threat to their own traditions and their independence. This split between the Celtic British Church and the Roman Catholic Church of the English lasted for many decades. It was finally resolved at the Synod of Whitby in 664 AD, when the King of Northumbria decided to follow the Roman practice. This was a decisive moment. It meant that the whole of England would now be part of the Roman Catholic Church, united with the rest of Christian Europe. The mission of St. Augustine was a turning point. It ended the pagan age of the Anglo-Saxons and brought them into the cultural world of Europe. It also meant that a form of Rome had returned to Britain, not as an army, but as a church. The Archbishop of Canterbury became a new kind of Roman official, and the Christian faith became a unifying force in the new English kingdoms. The legacy of the struggle. A new Britain is born. By the end of the 7th century, the intense struggle that followed Rome's fall began to settle into a new, more stable pattern. The Britain of 700 AD was unrecognizable from the Britain of 400 AD. The struggle had forged a new land with a new identity. The old Roman province of Britannia was gone forever. In its place were several distinct entities. 1. Anglo-Saxon England. In the east and south, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were now Christian and were starting to become more organized. The heptarchy was still in place, but the kingdoms were beginning to interact more through trade, marriage, and war. The idea of a single England was still in the future, but the foundations were there. 2. The Welsh kingdoms. In the west, the British people had consolidated their power in Wales. They had a strong cultural identity and were fiercely independent, though they were constantly fighting off pressure from the English kingdom of Mercia. 3. The Kingdom of the Scots. In the north, the Gaelic-speaking kingdom of Dalriada in modern Scotland was growing in power. The Picts were still a major force, but these two groups would eventually merge to form the Kingdom of Scotland. 4. Cornwall. Though being absorbed by Wessex, Cornwall still retained its distinct British culture and language. The legacy of the struggle was profound. The most obvious legacy is the English language. The language of the Anglo-Saxon invaders had taken root and would evolve into modern English. The division between England and the Celtic fringe, Wales, Scotland, Cornwall, was firmly established, a division that has shaped British politics ever since. The struggle also created a new social and political system. The Roman idea of a centralized state was replaced by a personal, feudal-like system based on the loyalty between a lord and his followers. This system would dominate the Middle Ages. The economy had been completely reset. The coin-based, trading economy of Rome was replaced by a rural, agricultural, and barter-based economy. It would be centuries before towns and trade recovered to their Roman levels. Finally, the story of the struggle itself became a powerful national myth. For the English, it was the story of how their ancestors conquered the land. For the Welsh, it was a story of heroic resistance and loss, embodied in the legend of Arthur. These different stories created different national identities that still exist today. The period after Rome's fall was not a blank page. It was a painful, violent, and chaotic birth. The Britain that emerged was poorer, less connected, and more divided than it had been under Rome. But it was also a new Britain, with new peoples, new languages, and new kingdoms. The struggle had cleared the ground for the medieval world and for the nations of England, Wales, and Scotland. From ruins to kingdoms, the long road ahead, as our story ends around the year 700 AD, Britain is on a long road to recovery. The worst of the chaos is over, but the island is still a place of multiple kingdoms and constant smaller wars. The journey from the ruins of Roman Britain to the stable kingdoms of the early Middle Ages was slow and difficult. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were now the dominant power. They were building a new culture, blending their own Germanic traditions with the Christianity they had adopted from Rome. They began to produce great art, like the magnificent gold and garnet jewelry found at Sutton Hoo, and great literature, like the epic poem Beowulf*. They started to write down their laws in Old English. The process of unification among these English kingdoms was beginning. The kingdom of Mercia, under powerful kings like Penda and Offa, would dominate the 8th century. Later, in the 9th century, the kingdom of Wessex would lead the resistance against a new wave of invaders, the Vikings and its king. Alfred the Great would first call himself King of the Anglo-Saxons, taking a major step towards a unified England. In the West, the Welsh kingdoms continued to hold out. They developed their own brilliant culture, with beautiful metalwork and a rich tradition of poetry. They would never be conquered by the Anglo-Saxons, but they would face new threats from the Normans after 1066 and would eventually be united with England centuries later. The struggle after Rome's fall teaches us that history does not always move in a straight line. Civilizations can and do collapse. Comfort, technology, and order can be lost. But it also shows the resilience of people. The inhabitants of Britain, both native and invader, adapted to their new world. They found new ways to live, to organize themselves, and to find meaning. They built a new world from the ruins of the old. They moved from the stone towns of Rome to the wooden halls of the Saxons. They moved from a centralized government to local lordship. They moved from a global economy to a local one. It was a harder world, but it was the world that gave us the English language, the nations of Britain, and the seeds of the medieval period. The fall of Roman Britain was a tragedy, but the struggle that followed was a creative one. It was the beginning of a new story. And with that, we close this chapter of History Sleep Stories. The long road ahead would lead to knights, castles, and the world of the Middle Ages, but that is a story for another time. Thank you for listening, and consider subscribing to History Sleep Stories for more stories from the past.